I don't know if that's high or low. That seems like a lot.
It's high,
Yeah.
but they're great. Net result, but now think of what it would cost to build a curriculum that robust.
Sure.
Okay. All right. I was just filibustering.
That's great. I need that when I'm setting up. It's perfect.
Okay. So you ready to go?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, let me see if I can. At some point or other, I'm going to need help with the kids' names and
Okay.
stuff like that.
Yeah.
But
I'll need a couple AA batteries charged up from one of those recorders. I don't know if you have them.
How many?
Just like two or three or four if you can do it. You guys can go though.
Okay.
I assume the cameras are above our knees. Okay.
Yeah, there is a wide shot.
Okay.
But that's just a cutaway.
Okay. Well, when I need it, I'll go for that.
Okay.
Well, thank you for letting me into your classroom today.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Oh, it was real fun, except for my knees. I'm getting old. I would like to run through the gamut of the 5 dimensions, but why don't we start just by my asking what stood out for you today? What were the most interesting moments? And then we'll get systematic after that.
Yeah, I think that the moments that are sticking in my mind are some really interesting sense-making moments that I saw with a couple of particular kids, but with the class more broadly. There were some students who were having trouble engaging in the task at first, and there were certain things that were hard for them, right? I'm thinking in particular of my student Steve, who at the very beginning of the lesson was like, "Can I go to the bathroom?" Right? And I was like, "No," right? And I said no to him because I was reading him wanting to leave as task avoidance, right? I saw that he had attempted the task. He wasn't exactly sure what to do. He hadn't been able to transfer what he had contributed in the discussion on the carpet to the independent time, and he was trying to leave, right? And I was really proud, I think, of the way that he and the students around him in the class stepped up. He stuck with it. He needed a little help. He got his help. He was able to figure something out important conceptually about how what we were doing today was related to the previous lesson in the sequence. And ultimately, he felt really proud of himself, right? And then he went to the bathroom, right? But there were lots of moments like that that stand out for me, moments where it wasn't quite clicking, and then it did, and the students felt like really good about that.
Yeah, there were a number that I noted as well. We might as well talk about that one particular student.
Sure.
You called her up, was it Evelyn? Or
Eveline?
Eveline, right.
Do you want to look at her work as we're talking?
Yeah.
I think it was this one, right, that you were working with her on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is the work. I assume you guys are going to copy it at some point?
If you want that piece of work, I will scan it and upload it.
Your choice, yeah. The Eveline?
Yes.
Okay. The progression in Eveline's work was really interesting. She was sitting with Maria and...
Montserrat. Monse? Maybe you wrote it down.
I did write it down.
You'll have to remind me.
Yeah.
They were sitting right over there.
Right, yeah. Eveline was sitting with Maria and Daniela. And Daniela was cruising along, and Eveline didn't quite get it. Part of what happened with her was that she was still stuck in yesterday's decomposing mode rather than putting things together. So where the task was something like 4 plus what is going to be 10, she had the 4, or it was 6 plus what equals 10. She had the 6 and divided it into 2 parts, and then put 10 in the other part, and then looked over to Daniela's page, and really didn't have a sense of what the task was about. So we sat and talked about that for a while, and she did it, and she worked through it very, very carefully. She was counting one by one each time, and she got the first one, and we moved and did the second one, at which point she got up. There are 2 on a page. She got up and got the next page and started to work, and I said, you want to do this one by yourself? And she said, uh-huh. And then I noticed you called on her. So take it from there.
Yeah, I had noticed when she was working with you, and also the way that she was working with the other children at the table, that she had figured something out, right? Like, I agree that initially she hadn't generalized the thinking that had gone into yesterday's lesson and other similar lessons we've done to the lesson that we were doing today. There was something about this novel context that was hard for her, right? And I did see that click that we were talking about, where she figured it out and was like, I can do this, right? And I can move on now, and I actually feel confident enough that, like, I'm going to say, I don't want your help anymore, right? Like, let me do it by myself. I look for moments like that often as moments to elevate during our summarizing conversation. Partly, even if like today I wasn't explicit with the students that Eveline had a hard time or that she changed her thinking, right? But for her, that is a real validation of the work that she put in. It's feedback around growth for her, right, about what happens when we don't give up. And then also for everybody else, like, that piece of work still specifies attainment, right? It still shows the other students, it gives the other students feedback about what success with the task looks like. And who better to have that come from than somebody who really figured it out in a way, in a pretty profound way over the course of one single lesson.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing to watch that happen.
Yeah.
I want to talk about that in general, that being having someone like Eveline come up and present to the class. I think a lot of people would be surprised that kindergartners could do something like that. So why don't you say a little bit about what you did to build a culture where that could happen, and then talk about some of the reasons that you do it and what you think some of the impact is. You've already suggested some for Eveline.
Of course. This speaks strongly, I think, to what we were talking about with culture and classroom culture at the beginning of, before the lesson this morning when we were talking. In this classroom, we do have a culture in which people share their thinking, and there's a very high expectation that people will share their thinking, right? And I think you might have noticed some of the language that I was using with students. Use your loud voice. You have important things to say, right? I think that the sharing of your thinking is an important piece in any like sort of disciplinary or interdisciplinary thought, right? Because what goes on in our heads, right, in math is only part of it, right? It's also how we communicate it with other people. And I think that, frankly, having the high expectation that students will share that thinking with other students has to be a part of a classroom where students are going to share their thinking, right? If we don't expect them to do it and we don't give them practice and support with it, then it's not going to happen. Now, there has been practice and support, right? And I think you will notice in the lesson, there were times where I helped students clarify language, right? Or I provided some language framing for students who needed language support. And I don't always do a perfect job with that, right? But I, in the moment, really try to support each student as little as I can in expressing his or her own thinking, because those words, right, are connected to the mathematical experience that students like Eveline had, and being able to describe, like, what you learned, your process, the big idea that you came away with from the day solidifies, it attaches meaning to the conceptual piece, to the content, to what the student's practicing.
Yeah, you've pointed to a number of the things I wanted to raise. So I think it's worth saying that it's that kind of rich conversation, that kind of describing your thinking in full sentences and being accountable, being able to communicate, that really is in the spirit of the Common Core standards. And many people would think that's an awful lot to ask of kindergartners. But if you provide the right structures, including the linguistic support, you know, you could see in the student's face, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be saying a full sentence, let me do it, that kind of thing. That it really works. I also noticed, and it's part of what's now the ingrained culture in this class, but it must have taken some work to build, the idea that first of all, students should revoice each other. So someone says something, and then the question is, how did so-and-so say it? And then, do you agree or disagree?
Right.
Which is a nice way early of decentering the math if the discussion is right. It's not about you and whether you got it right or wrong. It's about, is this thing true, and if so, what's the evidence for it?
Sure.
So do you want to say more about that? Or?
I would, yeah. I think that if you look at my lesson plans, you'll see that I think about questions in a couple of different categories. These aren't my categories. They're drawn most recently from a text called Classroom Discussions in Math.
Okay.
I sort of think of the first level of questioning or the first level of talk as being clarifying and sharing thoughts, right? And that's the piece that has to come first in any classroom, whether it's kindergarten or 12th grade, right? After that, I think today you pointed to there was a lot of engaging with the reasoning of others, right? Do you really understand what your friend said? Did you hear it, right? After that, there are a couple of other pieces around deepening your own thinking, right? Or deepening or engaging with the thinking of others. After that, like do you agree or disagree? What's your next step? Can you prove it? How do you know, right? Like those pieces come after. And I think that thinking about talk serving those different functions, you're right, does provide it does provide a culture in which if I disagree with you, right? Well, first off, do I disagree with you because I heard what you said, right? Or I didn't hear what you said? Okay, we're on the same page about that, right? Now let's have a conversation about the math. And it's not about you and me, it's about this mathematical idea that we're engaged in.
Cool. Why don't we, I think we've actually covered a lot of the terrain, but why don't we try to go through the 5 dimensions in the framework.
Okay.
So let's start with the mathematics. You told me earlier today about the particular reasons you chose the task that you did. So they were going to do composing as opposed to decomposing today, and it was based on yesterday's work. You also said that task design is really important. So I want to ask you about some of the aspects of the task design, just to get your thinking on that.
Yeah.
There were 2 things that I noticed that definitely weren't accidents. One of them is you chose to do 9 and 1. And the other is that when, I don't know if that's clear enough a reference. So one of them is that you chose to do 9 and 1, try once more. One of them is that the piece of work you chose from yesterday to start with decomposition was a 10 was 9 plus 1. And then you are going to go into composition. If I start with 9, how much more do I need to get 10? And 9 and 10 are about as close as you can get. And I wondered what the reasoning behind that choice was rather than, say, 6 and 4 or something like that. So why don't we start with that, and then I'll mention the second one later.
Yeah. That was an intentional choice, absolutely. And I think part of the thinking there, this is going to require an anecdote from the table. I was working with Brandon over at this table over here. And Brandon did the 9 and 1 composition task that we had modeled with the full class. It wasn't the first one that he did, right? But it was one that he had started with. Sorry, is the printer too loud?
I can kind of hear it in the background,
But it's not an issue.
it's not.
Okay, because I think it's Lauren, and I can tell her to stop printing if she needs to, or turn it off. Sorry. So Brandon was working at his table, and he was working with that same task, 10, composed with 9 and 1. And he did the front page, where there's 9 hearts, and then he needed to add 1 more heart. He did it pretty quickly. He had remembered that we had talked about it at the beginning, right? He flipped it over to the next page. He's like, this one's a lot harder, right? And I was like, why was this one a lot harder, right? And he said, this one was a lot harder because I had to draw a lot of hearts. And we checked, there were 9 hearts, right? He had done it accurately. But there was a piece there that I was anticipating, which was that having to draw a lot of hearts and then make sure that we had drawn a lot of hearts, and that we had drawn the correct number of hearts, right, and that we had represented them with the correct number, was potentially going to be something that wouldn't contribute to the mathematical discussion, right? And in fact, in the opening conversation, I think Derek was talking about, like, one of the comments he made when he came up with his idea to double the 9 was that I don't know how to draw hearts, right? It was already on his mind. So I was thinking about some of the other, like, kindergarten pieces. I was also thinking, quite honestly, that that would be a really easy composition for the students to recognize because the two groups are so visually distinct. 1 is a really small group, 9 is a really big group. You're right, as long as you're working with integers, that's pretty much as close as you can get to 10. I wanted us to have the conversation focused specifically on the linking of the work we had done yesterday to today, which happened, and then to send the students off to constructively struggle with some of those other numbers, right, without that whole group conversation context.
Right. So that was question number 1. Question number 2, you gave them pairs. So the same color pair had a 6 missing a 4 and a 4 missing a 6. What was in your mind when you did that?
I think when I was giving the students pairs, I was really curious to see if students were going to start picking up on this idea that these pairs are somehow related, right? I did push a couple of students to think about that at the same table I was talking about when Brandon was talking about a combination that was easy and a combination was hard. We actually looked at the 2 combinations together, and he and Danielle started saying, oh yeah, like, they're related, right? And I reminded them of a conversation we'd had about opposite combinations in another math context. I was just curious to see if there was going to be something surfaced there. It was another layer of depth that, of richness, or a place of engagement that those students who were understanding the concept of composing could start to engage in, right? Mathematicians definitely make use of and notice patterns, right? And some of the students were engaging in that aspect of mathematical practice. For other students, they were just like, oh, there's 2 combinations, they're stapled together, right? They weren't picking up on that piece, right? So that, I think, is related also to task design. That's an element of, I was trying to design a task that had some inherent differentiation, a place to go with students who were really, like, understanding the composition task and were doing it quickly and easily.
Yeah, and as an observer, I can say it was really pegged at the right level. When I saw the kids flip over the task, I went, ooh, are they going to get this? And that's exactly the space that they were in, where for some of the kids, they had enough fluency to be able to step back and go, oh yeah, this is essentially the same thing. And for other kids, it was a brand new, well, I started counting with 6 before, and I'm starting counting with 4 now. And then I just do it up to 10, and oh, look, I got the same numbers, magic. So that comment about it being pegged at the right level leads us into cognitive demand or productive struggle. Or you had constructive struggle this morning, and that's actually good. It was a happy struggle, I think, for many of the kids. Do you want to say anything about that and maybe where you might be going with it next?
I think that one of the indicators that I see that the students were constructively struggling is that all of the learners in this class, and they range hugely in age and math ability and language, language background, right? They're very, very different in many ways. Everybody was engaged in the task, and there was something that was challenging about the task for everybody, right? So I pulled out one piece of student work. It's on Hell's. He's done an 8 + 2 = 10 combination. And on the 2 side, on the blank card, in his composition, he originally drew 3 hearts. He counted and realized that that wasn't 10, and he scribbled one of them out, right? We were talking about use of student work, and I know we'll talk more about that as we talk about the assessment strand. What that's showing me is that on Hell, and I've seen this on some of his other work also, he's approaching this in sort of a guess and check kind of way, right? That's where he is in his understanding of composing and decomposing numbers, and perhaps addition and subtraction more generally.
Mm-hmm.
But like that same task, right? That same work that he was doing, the guess and check strategy, other students were able to approach the task, right? Like Danielle, and start to have that understanding that the two compositions that were stapled together were somehow related, and they were able to start having conversations with their peers about that, right? So I think to that extent, like we talked a lot about task design, but the task did facilitate constructive struggle for the students.
We've pretty much done equity, but it's worth talking about.
Sure.
In the sense that one of the nice attributes of the task itself was that it had enough handholds in different way, enough entry points, so that every student could sink their teeth into it and then do legitimate mathematical work. So I think, once again, task design is a critical part of that, and it worked. I wonder if you can say something about your group work and the way group work supports that. We saw you doing it in whole class, and certainly you're circulating around the class, making sure that everybody got attention, everybody was engaged and supported. But can you say something about the way you support the work at tables?
Yeah, I think that one of the things, so there were a couple of choices that I made. One choice is that the students don't have assigned seats at their tables, and certainly at sometimes I will group students intentionally for a variety of reasons. When you're engaging in a task like the one we were doing today, I think it's really valuable for the students to get the experience of talking to and seeing how people with different ideas and different levels of mathematical proficiency, quite frankly, are engaging with the same task. And the students were talking with one another as they were working, right? So there was a lot of communication from students who were thinking about the same task in different ways, and they were learning things from one another, right? I think beyond that, one of the things that I look back on this year in kindergarten and think like, yes, like I'm really glad this happened, is that students are having conversations independent of an adult being with them. And I would love to see the footage, because I was sort of snooping to hear what they were talking about. And I wasn't always able to listen in the way that I would have liked to. But I noticed on a number of occasions students at tables without an adult having a legitimate mathematical conversation about either something that they needed support with, something they were just thinking, or something they had noticed about the task, right? And these were students who weren't necessarily even working with the same composition, right? They were doing this across like items basically in the task. So I think that is a piece that I talked about this morning, moving student talk out of whole group settings and into like independent settings or small group settings, where there is an expectation that not only are you going to be engaged in your work, but part of being engaged in your work is talking to friends.
Right. And I saw you establishing the norms, whole group. You know, these are basically the way we talk mathematics. And presumably those are the norms that they're supposed to have with each other. Is there any other social support or other kind of support you do for a small group?
Yes, I mean, like the support is scaffolded and released over the course of the year. Quite honestly, one of the strongest indicators that students have that they're supposed to be talking to each other and not to me is when I put my hat on, right? And I do that as a visual symbol just for them, so that they know that like if they walk up to me and want to share something, right, they see that I'm talking to the other students and they walk away in many cases. And that's just yet another reminder that the person that you're communicating with about your work is not necessarily the teacher, and in fact you should be seeking validation, attention, mathematical conversation from the other people in the class.
Cool. Well, that's as good a segue as I could create into agency, authority, and identity. I mean, clearly in the case of Evelyn, you know, we saw someone who was struggling earlier, who was presenting to the class later. I thought that was a really nice move, having her do that. I wonder if you can say more, maybe thinking about particular incidents from today's class,
Sure.
about the kinds of things that you do that put students in a position where they can demonstrate what they know, what they've learned, what they've struggled with, while feeling safe.
Yeah. Totally. One student that's particularly standing out to me is Derek. Derek was the first student to come up after I had posed the initial question to the class about the relationship between the work we'd done yesterday and this new context, right? How many more did we need to get to 10? And I gave them a good amount of thinking time. I pulled an equity stick, which I was using a variety of different equity strategies, and we can talk about that. I know it's still related to equity, I think contributes to agency, identity, and authority, right? Derek came up, he said his idea right away, which is that he wanted to make another group of 4, another group of 1, and another group of 4. And already I had like 3 kids on the carpet who were like, no, it's 1, no, it's 1, right? And I think that that moment, that was reminding me of our conversation in the morning about that sort of like, how it can be scary to relinquish control to the students and to pursue an idea to its full extent, right? Because I think in that moment, if I shut it down and I'm like, actually, let's hear from someone else, right?
It could have been a disaster.
It could have been really hard, right? Or if like I had let the students who had already figured out the answer, who had maybe counted up from 9, as you were talking about with the choice of the modeling problem, like that also would have diminished Derek's authority as a mathematician, and he was doing something legitimate, right? Like he was really paying attention to the visual grouping of the hearts on the card. He wanted to reproduce it. He was sure that that was going to make 10, right? And I think that also having him like work through his idea and having him be the person to be like, oh yeah, that doesn't make 10, and to revise his idea presented him to the class and him to himself as the kind of person who can change his mind, right? And the kind of person who works through something. I also think that problem or that interaction was a really valuable experience for the other students to see, because I saw a number of other students having to revise their thinking in the exact same way that Derek did, right? Especially when it came to the 10 plus 0 composition, right? Students were drawing hearts and then they were having to like take some away and be like, oh yeah, actually, I don't need any more, right? I saw a number of other students who were adopting that same stance to the challenge of having too many hearts, right? I think that was really valuable for him.
Yeah, and specifically about identity, it's interesting to know, when people say, I want people to develop positive mathematical identities, the simplest version of that is I want people to think of themselves as good math people, which means they get the right answer. And what Derek was developing was a sense of himself as someone who can work through things in a way where it's just fine to revise your thinking if you're making progress. That is what part of being a mathematician is. And I can tell you as a once professional mathematician, when you spend 10 years on one problem, you do a lot of revising.
Yeah.
So let's move to assessment.
Okay.
Again, loads of opportunities for it, but I just like to get your thoughts on camera for that.
Of course. So I did get to look at the student work from today. I mentioned that as being the primary source of formative assessment data that I am considering, along with student talk. I noticed, similarly to the previous day's work, that the majority of students have accurate compositions that get to 10, and most students have more than 1, right? They were able to do, like, say, 2 plus 8 and 8 plus 2, and 6 plus 4 and 4 plus 6, right? So the quality and accuracy of the work that I saw is high. The work also demonstrates, for instance, I talked about Angel already, and you talked about Daniela working at her table, right? Some of these students who were sort of plowing along in using a strategy that maybe I would like to push them away from, right? Maybe I would like to do some work with them around thinking strategically about how many hearts you need and using other mathematical models before you start drawing them on your paper, right? And then counting as your primary as your primary way to see if you've made 10, the guess and check, right? So there are lots of different patterns that come out of the student work, and there's lots of different ways to sort it, ranging from what's the most common combination that students worked with. Were there any that were particularly challenging, and why? Like, there are lots of next steps that I see coming out of this work, and that's all coming from the student work.
Cool. I'm now at the point where it's random thought
Sure.
time. So this is above and beyond the lesson, and the only thing that may be left that we'll actually want to capture is my saying thank you and asking my final question.
Okay.
But I was trying to wonder about what we call the affordances of the particular task, the affordances and constraints. The playing cards have the very nice property that the kids see a visual pattern, and that helps the kids who are counting quite a bit. You could see that they use the counting structure, the organization of the things on the cards very nicely.
Yeah.
It was interesting that they had different counting strategies, some going back and forth that way, some getting lost because they went down and then up, and ooh, did I count that bottom one? So still very much an issue for some of the kids.
Totally.
But they had a static resource, and one of the things that eventually we want, not necessarily now, is that 10 is 10 and it doesn't matter how it's arranged. So what if I'd given them 10 Unifix cubes?
Yeah.
Or 8 Unifix cubes and said, can you make 10? I just wonder what that might do mathematically and what issues it might pose for them if you took these 2 away, or if you saw these 8 out of those 10, but I took these 8 out of those 10. Would you need the same number to add and such? So I was thinking about that as a possible way it could go.
Of course. So I think thinking about that, there are a variety of different ways that students have experienced composing and decomposing over the course of this year, right? And some of that work has been with a variety of different math tools, which in many cases are tools that the students have selected themselves, right? I think that part of the intentional choice in this lesson sequence to not have the students work with different models of decomposition and to have them have that static resource. That static resource absolutely was a scaffold. And the reason it was the appropriate scaffold in this case was so that they wouldn't have to worry about issues of organization and issues related to precision and organization and representing objects at the same time that they're really trying to access this important mathematical idea, which is that the composition and decomposition are somehow related, the groups are the same. And I wanted that to come out of the talk. Absolutely, like I think having the same experience with less structure in that case would be a direction to go, not only for the rest of this year, but for next year in first grade as the students are starting to are solidifying their conceptual understanding and starting to develop fluency with addition and subtraction. I think that my strongest evidence that this was the appropriate amount of scaffolding for this lesson was that we were able to elicit through talk this idea that composing and decomposing are somehow related, and that students were able to articulate this fundamental understanding in kindergarten that even if the hearts are visually in different places, the quantity is the same and the composition and decomposition is the same.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me that the additional complexity of recognizing eightness no matter what, on top of the composing and decomposing, sort of like learning to juggle while learning to ride a unicycle. It's easier to do one at a time, and the scaffolding was right. So that, too, again, is an element of task design.
Yeah. One other thing that I will point out, you didn't see students using cubes, and the manipulatives are freely available. I actually had 10 frames that I had printed out that I was expecting some students to need to use to really figure out how many more they would need to get to 10. I didn't explicitly suggest to students that they use tools, but I was prepared to tell students who were struggling, let's get these tools. Can you think of some tools that might help you find something that you can use to construct a model, right?
Yeah.
Again, I think that in this particular case, that would have reflected the design of the task, not meeting the students precisely where they were, but I was prepared to have that be an additional scaffold to bring in if needed.
Okay, so let me ask my last question.
Sure.
Which is, what should I have asked you that I didn't?
I'm thinking about your different pillars. I mean, I think we touched on this briefly this morning, right? And I think that there's this piece about the whole child that we talked about that didn't necessarily come out directly in our closing conversation. A mathematical identity is one component of these children's identities, right? And their identities are rich. I just do want to say that having this mathematical identity is absolutely not incompatible. It's completely compatible with being somebody who knows how to engage in rigorous math, right? And I certainly understand, like, we want our students to be happy, right? Especially our kindergartners, right? In many cases, this is their first year in school. And I really hear parents and some other teachers talking about how they're worried about students being able to engage in this type of thinking, and is it developmentally appropriate, right? And I don't want to be reductionist about this, right? Like, we have to, school is a place to learn, right? And that's fundamental, right? But doing rigorous, complex mathematics that's rich, right? That is part of having, that is part of being a happy kid. It's right. And I think that you see that when you look at the lesson from today, and a lesson that you would come in and see on any day in this classroom, right? So I do want to just really push this idea that rigorous, complex, rich math is absolutely developmentally appropriate, and it doesn't have to be something that makes your kid cry.
Yeah, I'm with you completely. I mean, the whole notion of constructive struggle, productive struggle, is about the fact that you learn that you can do things. It's consistent with growth mindset. Yeah, you have to work, but that's how you get better at things. And I think I'm really glad you mentioned whole child at the end and brought that together for a number of reasons. Colleagues of mine talk about teaching as a relational activity, where it's not just about the content, it's about building a relationship between teacher and student, between the students, so there's an environment in which everybody collaborates in each other's learning. And that was so nice to see today. The other thing that was nice for me personally is that we developed this framework, the Teaching for Robust Understanding of Math, or True Math framework, mostly from the literature and from my experience, which was recently in middle school classrooms and up. So part of the question for me was, when I'm in a third grade class, when I'm in a kindergarten class, do those questions, do those dimensions make sense? Or do they provide leverage into thinking and talking about productive math classrooms? And I saw them come alive in class today, and they certainly lived in our conversation, so thank you on multiple levels.
Thank you.
Great. I think we're done. That was really neat.
I really appreciate it. Thanks.